Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is, again, the Monday edition here of Point of View. And this week is Election Day, Election Week. And, of course, we don't know whether we'll have an election night or an election week or an election month. Those are questions that are going to be discovered by tomorrow night. But in the meantime, we certainly have a lot to talk about. Let me just mention the next hour we'll have Joseph Backholm with us. He is Senior Fellow for Biblical Worldview and Strategic Engagement at the Family Research Council. We're going to talk about why Christians should vote, and that will be, I think, very important for those of you that have not voted. I want to give you some of those numbers in just a minute. And then in the third hour, we will be talking with Colonel Alan West. He wants to talk about the election, also talks about some of the things that have been happening in terms of the campaign, including the Trump supporters that surrounded the Biden bus and some of that. So we'll get into quite a bit of that over the next couple of hours. But the totals, which gives us a pause because nobody actually is voting today except by mail, puts us at 96 million individuals that have already voted. That's about 35 million people that have voted in person. And almost 61 million people, change almost, that are, it's just 60,900,000. So anyway, but almost 61 million people that have voted by mail. But here's the outlier. 30 million mail-in ballots are outstanding. Now, by outstanding, that might mean that they're coming in the mail, maybe have arrived but haven't been counted yet, or are in the hands of individuals who either are going to vote today and then get it in the mail. Some actually in some of these states can even vote tomorrow and put it in the mail, but that's asking quite a bit given what we have right now. And then, of course, there's a good number of those individuals that aren't going to vote. And so you can see why you really don't want to pay attention to all these polls. The claim right now is that the former Vice President Joe Biden and Senator Kamala Harris have an easy victory to the White House, and they might as well just start measuring the curtains for the Oval Office. Let me, for just a minute, for those of you that are younger, remind you that those kinds of statements have been said before, and they were completely wrong. For even some of you older listeners, maybe you weren't around in 1980 when almost the day before the election, the prediction was Jimmy Carter would win re-election against this upstart by the name of Ronald Reagan. Well, that didn't happen. As a matter of fact, that last surge was probably enough to put him over. There were still some suggestions that Walter Mondale might still win the election against Ronald Reagan in 1984. And, of course, Ronald Reagan won 49 states. Probably the closest ones, of course, are in the more recent history. In 1980, I was actually doing a broadcast. At that time, it was at KCBI, but also was working with Moody, so we were doing a couple of different things in which they announced that Florida was won by Al Gore. And what happened then was that people in the central time zone in Florida, known as the Panhandle, said, well, why do I bother to vote? So they did not, and so it may have actually suppressed the vote rather significantly when you made that announcement. I'm fully predicting that there will be some major network, might be a cable network, that will predict Joe Biden has already won before the polls close in many of the states, but we'll see. But, of course, we know what happened there. George W. Bush actually eventually, through a whole series of very interesting questions and counting and Supreme Court decisions and everything, eventually won the state of Florida. Then, of course, 4 years later, won by 50.5% of the vote in Ohio, which gave him enough to beat John Kerry. And, of course, we all, I think, remember 4 years ago in which the announcement was that Hillary Clinton was going to win, and there was an incredible amount of excitement, which kind of drained rather dramatically as Donald Trump beat the odds and won. So, nevertheless, this is why we certainly have to say that the only poll that really matters happens tomorrow. But we are in uncharted territory for two reasons. Number one, we've never had this many people vote ahead of time, which means that some of those people voted, obviously, before the second debate. Many of those people voted and did not even know there was a Hunter Biden laptop that and a story about the New York Post, which, by the way, finally now has had their Twitter account unlocked. Can you believe how long that has been locked up for the fourth largest newspaper in the country? Anyway, that's another whole story, and of course all sorts of other things that have transpired since then. So, and of course the other aspect of that is we've never had so many outstanding mail-in ballots still in play and what that might mean. And so it brings us to, of course, one of the things I would encourage you to do. If you're listening right now and you've not voted, I encourage you to vote tomorrow. We will spend some time talking with Joseph Backholm about the importance of one vote, why it's even important to vote even if you're not in the majority. And I'm going to save some of that for the next hour because many of our listeners find themselves in states where it's pretty obvious the state is going to go in a different direction in the way they're going to vote. But the other thing you can do, whether you voted or not, and for certainly those of you that have voted, I hope you'll focus on praying for this election and praying for this nation. The email that I sent out just the other day said, as Americans continue to head to the polls, we need to cover the election process in prayer. And so we put together a prayer challenge, which had 6 points. Number one, pray that Americans who intended to vote can make it to the polls and that their votes will be counted. Number two, pray that fraud attempts will be thwarted. Because as you know us talking about on this program, and even a recent booklet I had come out, looked at the issue of voter fraud, of which there is some real concerns, and much of that happened in the Democratic primary. So for people to say, well, this is just something Republicans are bringing up because they want to pursue voter suppression, almost all the examples of voter fraud from February on were all on the Democratic side, and where Democrats were doing it against other Democrats. Number three, pray that our country is protected from domestic or foreign threats. I'm going to get back to that a little bit later this hour. Number four, pray that the results of the election are clear and decisive. This would be so much better for the country, no matter who wins, that they win so decisively that we do not go into overtime, but we'll see. Right, number five, pray that God would grant us peace and prevent violence after the election. And again, I want to talk about that in the next hour, or maybe even in the next segment. We'll get into that for a little bit of detail. And then number six, pray that God would grant the elected leaders wisdom, strength, and desire to know him more. So that was the prayer request that I sent out the other day. After the break, I will give you a preview of one that will be going out shortly and probably will land in your inbox about what I thought would be some prayer targets for this eve of Election Day. And if you have something to write with, let me encourage you to come back after the break with something to write, because I want to talk about some of these prayer meetings. There are quite a number. For those of you in the state of Texas, there is one that Bunny Pounds has put together. It's called a virtual prayer meeting. It has David Barton and Allie Beth Stuckey and June Hunt and Mike Hayes and all sorts of individuals, which is more a little bit focused on Texas. And then there is this national virtual call to prayer, and I'll talk about that as well. So I want to give you all the details, and I want you to write them down and participate in prayer right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Tomorrow's the election, so you may have already voted like tens of millions, but if you haven't, I encourage you to vote because your vote might make the difference. In the past, many groups circulated articles and emails talking about the importance of one vote. In the last few elections, we haven't needed these reminders because some of the elections in the last few decades provided numerous illustrations. For example, George W. Bush won the 2000 presidential election by the slimmest of margins. His election essentially was decided by 537 votes in Florida. He won re-election in the 2004 presidential election again by a very slim margin. He won the 20 electoral votes from the state of Ohio with 50.8% of the vote. Over the years, I've collected some stories of elections that resulted in a tie. You can't get any closer than that. Consider the story of Penny Pullen in Illinois. It turned out that it was a tie, and so they ordered a coin toss, and she lost in the coin toss. Later, she found out that many members of her church hadn't bothered to vote in the primary election, and they could have made a crucial difference. In 2006, there was an even more interesting story of an electoral tie. William Crawford and Jean Miller both received an identical number of votes in an election in Ohio. William Crawford was especially upset. You might ask why. Well, it turned out that his two sons failed to vote that day. His son Jim lives across the street from him. His other son Andy is a college student who lives at home with him. Neither took the time to go to the polls. Would the outcome of these elections be different if a few people in Penny Pullen's church had bothered to vote, or if either of William Crawford's sons had bothered to vote? Does one vote count? Just ask Penny Pullen or William Crawford. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of the booklet, A Biblical View on Pornography, go to viewpoints.info/pornography. That's viewpoints.info/pornography.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation at any point, 1-800-351-1212. Perhaps you'd like to make a prediction on who you think is going to be our next president, maybe some predictions about some of the various senatorial and congressional races. I am going to talk about that in just a minute. But after we talk about this issue of prayer, if nothing else, I want to talk about the real concern on the part of many cities right now about violence after the election, and how, in some respects, I've got some quotes here saying, I have never seen this level of preparation since really 9/11. And so we'll talk about that in just a minute. And if that doesn't cause you to spend some time in prayer, I don't know what else I can say. But I just talked about the email we sent out yesterday. In a couple of minutes, or certainly by the end of this day, you will get an email from me in which I'm talking about what to pray for on the eve of the election day. And obviously we want to pray about the election, but also this issue of threat of violence, which we certainly want to pray that it will not happen. But I have kind of 4 prayer targets there. Pray for his will to prevail in this election. Pray for the protection of our freedoms. Pray for our nation's safety, and pray for peace. And if you are wanting to participate in different prayer events, I know right now, even in my own church in the chapel, they have a time where people can gather in the chapel and pray at the noon hour. But many of you say, well, I can't make it to a church to pray, but I'd like to participate in one of these prayer events. Let me especially mention this one because it's not exclusively for Texas people, but a lot of the people that will be praying in this virtual prayer meeting are in the state of Texas and are certainly praying about that. And it's part of what's called Christians Engaged. You can type in Christian Engaged virtual prayer meeting. Just do a Google search or something like that, or even type in some of the key speakers, because you have David Barton, who will be one of the guests there. You have June Hunt. You have, of course, an individual who used to be on this program with us, Ali Beth Stuckey. You have Representative Michael Cloud. You have Pastor Mike Hayes, Tracy Bradford, just all sorts of people that we would know, and, of course, Bunny Pounds. So if you want to type in, like, Bunny Pounds Christians Engaged, you'll find it that way. If you want to type in Christians Engaged virtual prayer meeting, and that is going to take place tonight at 6:30 p.m., Again, I'm talking Central Time, since I know most of our listeners in this hour are either in Texas or Minnesota. But if you happen to be, I know some of you listen out on the West Coast during this hour, or even if you're on the East Coast, you just have to, in the case of East Coast, add an hour, so that would be 7:30 your time. Or, of course, those of you in the California, Nevada area, that would be 4:30 your time. But again, it's just a great opportunity to hear from many people that we've interviewed before on a virtual prayer meeting. That one isn't exclusively for Texas, but it's going to have maybe a little more of a Texas flair. But the one I did want to talk about, and we'll certainly mention next hour, is there is this national prayer meeting that is coming together. And so that one is one that has already taken place yesterday. And so you can go on Facebook and find that. So that would be one place to find it there. Also, I understand they're also going to have another one tonight. So again, you can certainly just look for the call to prayer, and you're going to see, kind of a who's who, either to look at what has already happened, and that includes people like Gary Bauer and Eric Metaxas, Michelle Bachman, all sorts of people have been on the program, different pastors like Jack Graham and Greg Laurie and Samuel Rodriguez, and, all sorts of individuals. So that is, again, another prayer event, which already, one part of that's already taken place on Sunday, and the other one, I believe, is coming up. So, nevertheless, just wanted you to know about there are just a variety of prayer events. Matter of fact, we really could probably fill a whole program just talking about all the ones that I'm aware of, because some of them are national, some are state and local, and all of the rest. Now, just before we move on to some other issues, a little bit later, I even have a whole list of things we should be praying about, and I've given you sort of a short list, but some people have certainly called for praying for this nation. I do want to speak to those of you who have not voted yet, or those of you that have voted, but you know somebody, or you have connections to somebody that has not voted yet. And one last time, I do want to point you to our website, pointofview.net, and we have a button there which has for iVoter Guide. And the team there says that they have spent more than 30,000 hours of research in order to vet more than 5,000 candidates in 2,200 different races. And those, of course, are President, Senate, House, and a few number of statewide battles. So, again, just an incredible amount of time and energy that has been placed into that as well. And again, when you look at some of those very significant issues, we can talk about some of these races, which are very, very close. We're going to do some of that a little bit later next hour, and how, again, anybody who thinks one vote does not matter, well, what you probably can do is simply go to my Viewpoints commentary today, which tells the story. I always like to run this about every 2 years or 4 years, because I tell the story not only of how close the election was with George W. Bush, winning by 537 votes in Florida for a presidential election, but I also, over the years, have collected a couple of these races that ended up in a tie. Penny Pullen, who's somebody I've done broadcasts with in the past, lost because it was a tie. Later found out there were a number of individuals. She lost on a coin toss, by the way. That's how they solved that problem. Found out later all sorts of people in her church didn't vote for her, and if just the people in her church that came up and said, "Oh, Penny, if I'd known it was important, I would have voted for you," she still would have been serving in the Illinois legislature. And my all-time favorite is William Crawford and Gene Miller, because that was another one identical. This one was, just amazing. And William Crawford upset because, well, it turns out his two sons didn't vote. His son Jim, who lived across the street, didn't vote, and his son Andy, who was a college student and lived at home with him, neither of them took time to vote. And if either his sons voted for him, He would have then served in, I think it was a city council race back there in Ohio. It's fun. I have others, but those are the most intriguing because they illustrate the point. When you can't get people in your own church to vote for you, when you can't get your own kids to vote for you, I mean, there are other stories like that, but those just are so much fun, except if you're one of those kids at the Thanksgiving table. Let me, just before we take a break here, and I do want to talk about some of the concerns about violence, also mention that on Friday we did talk about, as you well know, the fact that on two separate occasions, both the Girl Scouts and the sorority Kappa Delta posted very positive messages about the fact that you had Amy Coney Barrett, who became a Supreme Court justice. And we even have still the picture here of this really nicely produced Twitter post that has, of course, Sandra Day O'Connor, who's no longer alive, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who's no longer alive, but Elena Kagan and Sonia Sotomayor, who are on the Supreme Court and now have added Amy Coney Barrett. And so, again, the Girl Scouts posted, "Congratulations, Amy Coney Barrett, on becoming the fifth woman appointed to the Supreme Court since its inception in 1789. You would think that could not possibly be controversial, and it was. And so, of course, not only did the Girl Scouts pull it down, but then they just apologized incredibly and saying this was not supposed to be a political or partisan statement. And in addition to them pulling it down, you also have the sorority Kappa Delta, because Amy Coney Barrett is a sorority sister with all the KDs out there, posted a similar kind of message. The woke mob came after them, and they pulled it down. So we did give you a petition on Friday that you could actually sign. But now we have something else which I wanted to make available to you, and it really wasn't going live until after the program. And that is, if you go back to that, if you've already gone there, great, but you can go back to it again and click on that little button that has, again, Girl Scouts and Kappa Delta succumb to the woke mob, I should say. Then we give you the information, but if you put in your name, address, and email, we give you the contact information so that you can actually send this email to both the Girl Scouts and Kappa Delta. Now, again, we give you, as I've mentioned before, a suggested letter. I would encourage you to go in there and modify it so it doesn't just look like a form letter, but, express your opinion. Be gracious, but this has given you an opportunity to send your email to these two particular organizations, and because of the way it's worked, I've understood that it protects your personal information. So some people say, well, I don't want to have them just cause me all sorts of problems, put me on some list or anything like that. And so if you would like to express your opinion to the Girl Scouts or to Kappa Delta, we've made it possible once again for you to do that on pointofview.net. And I think it's a good example of no matter who is elected on Tuesday, tomorrow, we're going to have to fight some of these culture battles. And this is one of those, which I think you might want to participate in. Let's take a break. We're going to talk about some of the concerns about violence surfacing right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Let me just mention that next hour we will be talking with Joseph Backholm, talking about why Christians should vote. Posted two very good articles that get into that, the importance of one vote. Of course, we've already talked about that a little bit in my Viewpoints commentary. And also, if I'm not in the majority in my state, why should I vote anyway? And I think the answer is, well, you should still exercise your civic duty. So we'll spend some time talking with him about that. Next hour, of course, we're going to be talking with Colonel Alan West, and he's got a couple of very good pieces of information that we've posted by him as well. One is written, one is a video that you can watch, and he also wants to make some comments about what happened to the Biden bus and how that was confronted by some of the Trump supporters. So let's, before we finish off this hour, talk about a couple of things which we hope won't happen. Number one, that the election will be fought out in the streets. And that's a real concern because you're starting to see more and more stores and other things being boarded up. And I'm going to read to you in just a minute some of the headlines and then some of the statements being made by some of the people in law enforcement. And then second of all, that this particular election will be fought out in the courts. Are you aware of the fact that there are 325 lawsuits and counting that have been filed in this regard? And I just found this one in Politico. The Biden camp, this would be, of course, Joe Biden, former vice president, camp quietly raises money for post-election court brawl. So they're expecting that this might go into overtime and there will be all sorts of suits and countersuits and all sorts of things. I really pray that will not happen. But let's look at worst-case scenario for a moment, because if nothing else, I think these topics should be on the table as well. Let's read some headlines here. That this one comes from Jim Garrett. He's pulled together a good list. I'll look at 4 cities just to give you an idea. New York City. Many businesses in New York City are boarding up their stores in preparation for potential mayhem as Election Day approaches. Los Angeles. From Beverly Hills to Hollywood to downtown Los Angeles, crews have been busy adding plywood and protective fencing in front of businesses and residential complexes. How about we head to Chicago? In Chicago, it says, in preparation of potential unrest in Chicago leading up to and following Tuesday's general election, Macy's State Street has boarded up windows at the iconic location. And then, of course, we're certainly been hearing about this in Washington, D.C. There in the district, despite the wet weather Sunday morning, workers near the Black Lives Matter Plaza were busy erecting more plywood barriers over some buildings' windows. If you did not know any better, you would be forgiven if you thought they were prepping for a big storm about to blow into the nation's capital. You think? And, of course, let's just be honest enough to recognize that sometimes, even in a celebratory mood, individuals sometimes will go into this as well. Let's face it, that this has been a good year for Los Angeles, hasn't it? First of all, you had the Los Angeles Lakers. After they won the NBA title, Los Angeles downtown saw 76 arrests after celebrations turned unruly. And then, again, if you haven't been paying attention, Los Angeles Dodgers won the World Series later that month. And again, 8 people were arrested. Multiple officers were injured. A semi-truck was looted, police vehicles. So in some cases, even if you win, you see the looting and rioting. But if indeed you would think that most of this would happen if Donald Trump won and they would then perceive that Biden lost, it would get even worse. To get into the details for just a minute, let me quote from this particular piece by Jake Dima, writing in the Daily Caller, which he pulls out some really good material because the New York City Police Department, he says, have told businesses within the boroughs to prepare for possible political violence. Then the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, let me just quote from the Wall Street Journal, reported that as well. The department has reportedly been preparing for weeks to keep the city secure in event of an election-induced calamity. According to Fox News, you have Miami, Portland, Seattle, Minneapolis, Orlando, Chicago, and other cities preparing for possible violence. And even that is not enough. Let me come back to New York for just a minute, because the vice president of the New York-based Sergeants Benevolent Association told the Daily Caller News Foundation they hadn't seen such disaster preparation in the city since the 9/11 terrorist attacks. One of the individuals said stuff like this was done during 9/11 when everybody went to 12-hour tours, but they basically put the whole job on alert right now. He says, I'd be lying to you if I said I wouldn't be worried. We've already seen cops getting assaulted in New York the last time this broke out. This is not something to take lightly. And they're actually starting to cancel days off, going on their form of tactical alert in Los Angeles. They're probably preparing response teams. They're going to get those rosters all squared away, make sure they've got the equipment they're going to need. So this level of preparation we haven't seen really since 9/11. Now, what would be the targets? Up until now, I've heard most of those targets would be kind of downtown. But it was our friend Gary Bauer who pointed this out on Friday, that it's a little bit different, because apparently now you've had the various people in law enforcement in the District of Columbia who actually paid him a visit and sent him some information and then made a phone call in which he said, quote, I'm quoting Gary Bauer now, a coalition of the worst far-left neo-Marxist groups in Washington called Shut Down D.C. is promising attacks on conservative organizations and their leaders in the Washington, D.C. area. And he goes on to say, I wanted to let you know right away that the Campaign for Working Families, which, of course, he is the head of, in addition to, of course, heading up American Values, is one of the organizations that has been targeted. If you go through the list, you can see it's the kind of people that we interview: Concerned Women for America, Family Research Council, you go down the list, and, of course, this one by Gary Bauer. And so he points out that these radicals battled police in the streets on Tuesday of last week. Most of the local media completely ignored what happened. The bottom line was, as he says, in the District of Columbia, 15 officers were seriously injured. One might be permanently blinded by these groups. And so he says, we've seen some of these people before, for example, in the streets of Kenosha, Minneapolis, and Portland. And so right now he's working to try to figure out what security measures they can take to protect their office and staff. And so that's another real source of prayer and concern. I pray that this does not happen, but I think this is a twist that I had not seen coming, that instead of just focusing on downtown businesses and spray painting various establishments, breaking windows, overturning cars, setting them afire, none of which is good, now are starting to target some of these conservative organizations, some of whom we've, of course, interacted with as well. Just before we take a break, though, even if there isn't any, if you will, violence in the streets, there is going to be quite a bit of a battle in the courts if indeed this is not a landslide election one way or another. I quoted from you Politico. The Biden camp quickly raises and quietly raises money for a post-election court brawl. The best estimates I can come up with right now is that there have been at least 325 different lawsuits. Can you believe that? 325. And that was a count from a couple of days ago, so probably much more, that have been filed in 45 states, including the Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico as well. So not only in 45 states, but also the district and Puerto Rico. One individual who has been looking at this, a law professor at the University of California at Irvine School of Law, says the amount of litigation is almost certainly going to be a record. And so you've had the development of a legal war room, which was put together by Mark Elias. He is the individual who was a general counsel to the former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and worked in the 2016 presidential campaign. So he is actually leading the war room for Joe Biden's campaign. And so this battle is going to take place for some time. And of course, part of this has to do with what has come from the other side, and that is President Donald Trump has been saying that we are headed towards election fraud. His tweet, for example, the greatest election fraud in our history is about to happen, and we might have the most corrupt election in history. So there's every piece of evidence to suggest that indeed Donald Trump is not going to concede the election Tuesday night. We already know that Joe Biden has been counseled by Hillary Clinton not to concede the election by Tuesday night. So this may not go into overtime if it has become an incredible landslide, but if indeed we're still counting votes in Pennsylvania, which I think is one of those key states which we will look at, then we may not necessarily have any answer Tuesday night or even Wednesday morning. But that's why you need to stay tuned to Point of View, because we'll be talking about it for as long as it takes. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View. your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and then we're going to spend some time talking about why it's important for Christians to vote, and then we'll get into some of the other issues that certainly are relevant is this day before the election. And I mentioned just a minute ago this idea of election fraud. Now, that's something that President Donald Trump has been talking about a great deal. But what are the facts? Because you do get conflicting statements being made. For example, the Brennan Center for Justice has argued that voter fraud isn't rampant, it is rare, and it's not a big issue. And of course, I would immediately want to say, well, if it isn't, then explain to me who won the election that took place in the third largest city in New Jersey, Paterson. So bad and so much election fraud that they finally had to get a mulligan and say that particular city council race will be decided tomorrow because they had to postpone it. Who won the 12th congressional election in New York because that one was riven with fraud as well. And so, yes, I recognize that not every election has fraud, but you've had some really good examples that have happened completely on the Democratic side, because the argument's always been, well, this is just something Republicans use to try to justify voter suppression. Okay, well, these were all on the Democrat side. These were Democrats against other Democrats trying to win an election, and a number of people now have been convicted of that fraud. Now, if you want to say, okay, I'd like to look at those, it's a reasonable question. Heritage Foundation has established what's called the Election Fraud Database. We've talked about it before. It's been put together by Hans von Spakovsky. You might say, well, who is he? Well, he actually served on the Federal Elections Commission. It is really a sampling. It is not even expected to be considered a comprehensive list of election fraud. So it is more, if you will, just full of stories, but it's not completely comprehensive, and yet they have 1,300 proven incidences of voter fraud. In other words, just the allegation doesn't put it on the list. You have to be convicted of voter fraud. You see the point? 1,300. By the way, more than a dozen of those have happened since January, including some I just mentioned a minute ago. The cases out of this year involved either range from forged signatures or falsifying registration forms or voting more than once, or in a couple of cases, bribing homeless people to vote a certain way. Those have happened just this year, okay? So Hans von Spakovsky says, look, okay, the Brennan Center says that fraud isn't widespread. He says, you know, that's possibly the case, but it's misguided. While voter fraud might be relatively rare, it still can be impactful in certain races. You think? Because those are the races where it's close. And as I've pointed out before, you might say, well, why don't we have more convicted cases of voter fraud? I don't know, 1,300 strikes me as quite a few. But as I pointed out many times before, in many states, in many locales where voter fraud might be prosecuted, and at best it's a misdemeanor, it's a slap on the hand. And just think if you're a district attorney and you have some really important cases out there that involve robbery, burglar, rape, maybe even murder, how much time are you going to spend even convicting voter fraud anyway, especially if by chance you were elected because of voter fraud? You can see why we don't have more of those cases, and so it illustrates the point. But in addition to voter fraud, let's set that aside. For those of you that think that's not a big issue, there's some others that are actually described in this particular piece as well. One of those is the issue of late ballots, because late arriving mail ballots have been the subject of these lawsuits I've just talked about just a minute ago, and some of those cases have reached the Supreme Court. For example, last week, the Supreme Court upheld a lower court ruling prohibiting the state of Wisconsin from counting mail-in ballots that arrive after the election. And again, this makes some sense. If the law, which was passed in this particular case, Wisconsin, by the state legislature, says that the ballot has to arrive by election day, you can't then all of a sudden have some judge say, well, no, if it arrives 3 days later, in some cases it's November 6th. There's one case, I think it was a Pennsylvania case, where it was November 9th. And you can't just change the rules in mid-election. And so in that particular case, the Supreme Court, I think, ruled correctly. And most importantly, Chief Justice John Roberts agreed with that decision in Wisconsin. Unfortunately, in the cases out of Pennsylvania and North Carolina, he ruled the other way with the liberal judges. And so this is, again, one of the real big concerns, because the court refused to issue an order telling election officials in Pennsylvania whether to reject or accept late ballots. So the bottom line is that they're going to allow those ballots to be counted in this particular case up to 3 days following the election, even if they aren't even postmarked. So that's a real concern, because if indeed Pennsylvania holds the key to either the re-election of Donald Trump or the election of Joe Biden, we for sure will not know by Tuesday night who the next president is, because these ballots could still be coming in for days later. So that's an issue as well. So those are a couple of key issues. One more I thought I'd put on the table, if this doesn't cause you to just scratch your head. What about mismatched or missing signatures on ballots? Again, what you have here is a situation in which if you are going to vote by mail, and remember again, we have how many people that have voted by mail so far? That number is about 60,000, almost 61,000, and we have almost 31,000, about 30,500, 30 million, excuse me, I'm saying it wrong. We have 35 million cases of in-person votes, 60 million, almost 61 million mail ballots, and then another 30 million ballots that are outstanding. And if they come in and they don't have a matched signature, or they don't have a signature at all, should those be counted? And again, the more liberal interpretation is, well, we should have every vote counted. But again, the argument that has always been made is to make sure we don't have voter fraud, is to make sure that a person signs it and that the signatures match. And that's where the battle might take place. I'm hoping, as we've said before, that we have a landslide one way or the other, because if we start having to count or not count signatures that are either fraudulent or missing, you can see the problem that we would have for the issue of voter integrity, and the whole concern that might for sure turn this election into overtime. And if you don't think there wouldn't be some battles in the streets, well, I think that is certainly the case. My Viewpoints commentary today, as I've mentioned, is on close elections. I give you a couple of examples of close elections that have taken place in the past, going all the way back to 2000, the presidential election there, and then a couple of elections that were actually settled on a coin toss, if you can believe it, because there was an electoral tie. Happens every once in a while. Let's hope it doesn't happen too often this time, but nevertheless, wanted you to have some of those facts, figures, and other information. And as you go to the website, there is, again, the Take Action item for you today if you would want to contact the Girl Scouts or Kappa Delta that were willing to succumb to the woke mob. That is available to you, again, on the website, pointofview.net. And don't forget, we have the iVoter Guide. Maybe you've already voted. As a matter of fact, I would imagine a very significant percentage of you listening right now have. But you might know somebody that hasn't voted that maybe wants some more information, and that's why that iVoter Guide is still posted there for you to pass on to them as well. Let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about the importance of Christians voting in this election, and that's coming up right after this.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty. especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Monday edition of Point of View. It is election eve, and we are at a point right now where indeed we have 96 million Americans that have already voted. That works out to be about 35 million plus that have voted in person, and about 60 million, almost 61 million through mail-in ballots. Now, one of the things you're going to hear is, well, the election is over, but I think the biggest difficulty for individuals who are trying to predict what is going to happen is that we have more than 30 million mail ballots outstanding. And of course, we have millions and millions of people that are going to vote tomorrow. So anybody that really thinks they know what's going to happen come Tuesday night probably is actually maybe in need of a little humility. And there's going to be a fair amount of humbling of some of these pollsters indeed. So first of all, I wanted to, if nothing else, give you a little bit of a handle on the fact that we really don't know, and won't know even Tuesday night, if indeed some of these elections are close in states like Pennsylvania or others where you don't even have all of the ballots in hand, that they're allowed to count them days later. So that's one of the reasons why I'm sure you're going to hear somebody say, oh, it's already over. There's probably going to be some announcement. And if nothing else, all we have to do is look back in recent history and recognize that for those of you 20 years ago that are a little bit older, you might remember when they called the election for Al Gore in Florida. And that caused a lot of individuals in Florida that were in the central time zone in the panhandle to say, well, maybe I shouldn't vote. And then, of course, eventually it was George W. Bush that won the state of Florida. And we talk about this in my Viewpoints commentary today. And so a more recent one is everybody was absolutely convinced that 4 years ago Hillary Clinton was going to win. And we know who sat in the Oval Office. So this is why, if nothing else, I would encourage you to not pay too much attention to some of the announcements that are going to come down over the next couple of hours. You've heard me say it more than once. The only poll that really matters happens on Election Day, but of course, a very high percentage of individuals have already voted. What can you do if you've already voted? Well, whether you voted or not, you can pray for this country. And I sent out an email just the other day in which, as we were heading to the polls, I gave you 6 obvious prayer targets. Number 1, that Americans who intended to vote can make it to the polls and the votes will be counted. Number 2, pray that fraud attempts are thwarted. We'll get into that a little bit later, if not this hour, certainly next hour. Pray, number 3, that our country is protected from domestic or foreign threats. Number 4, pray that the results of the election are clear and decisive, and we'll talk about more of that later this hour as well. Number 5, pray that God would grant us peace and prevent violence after the election. We will be talking about that as well over the next hour or two. And number 6, pray that God would grant the elected leaders wisdom, strength, and a desire to know Him more. For those of you that receive an email, we've sent this out, probably has landed in your inbox by now, in which we talk about some other prayer targets today on the eve of Election Day. Number 1, pray that His will prevail in this election. Pray for the protection of our freedoms. Pray for our nation's safety, and pray for peace. Now, if you say, well, I would really like to be involved with other Christians in praying, there are a couple of ways to do so. For especially those of you in the state of Texas, but anybody can participate nationwide, there's a very good piece that has been put together today. Money Pounds has done this. You simply could go to what's called Christians Engaged, and it's a virtual prayer meeting. And it involves all sorts of individuals that we've interviewed on this program, people like David Barton and June Hunt and Allie Beth Stuckey, who used to be part of our Millennial Roundtable, and also Representative Michael Cloud, Pastor Mike Evans, Tracy Bradford. You go down the long list of individuals that are participating in that. That will be happening this evening. It is 6:30 Central Time, so if you're in the East Coast, it'd be 7:30 your time. All the way down to Pacific would be at 4:30 your time, and you can simply find that by going to, Christians Engaged and maybe even type in some of those names. If you'd like to already participate in something that has happened, there was a call to prayer nationally that took place last night on Facebook. And it took place November 1st at about 5 p.m. Eastern Time. And it included all sorts of individuals that, again, we've interviewed on this program. People like Tony Perkins and Gary Bauer and Eric Metaxas and Michelle Bachman. All sorts of pastors like Jack Graham and Greg Laurie, Samuel Rodriguez, and a variety of others. So, again, you can see that, participate in that after the fact, and I think they're going to do some rebroadcast. You can find that one on Facebook. So there are just a number of prayer events happening in various churches, various locales, virtual prayer events. So use your Google search to find some of those, and that will be the case. But I also recognize that there are some of you who are listening to this broadcast right now that have not voted yet. And I would encourage you to vote tomorrow. Or even if you have voted, let me just mention that you may know somebody that has not voted, maybe still undecided or needs some more information. And again, if you go to our website, pointofview.net, you will see that we have the iVoter Guide. And I got this from Debbie Withnow, who was on the program with us the other day. Their team, they estimate, spent over 30,000 hours of research in order to vet over 5,000 different candidates that are on the ballot in about 2,200 different races. And so if you want more information on those particular races, let me encourage you to go to our website. Or if you know somebody who hasn't voted yet or needs some more information, this has just been an incredible amount of work that they have put in there. And, of course, focused on a lot of the so-called battleground states, which we're going to be watching. Michigan, Florida, North Carolina, Georgia, even Arizona, Texas, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and a variety of others that we can mention where we broadcast. And so that information is also available at our website. And as you go to the website, let me also mention something we talked about on Friday. You might remember where the Girl Scouts of America were just thrilled that we now had a fifth woman actually put on the Supreme Court, Amy Coney Barrett. And so they posted a very nice piece that certainly saluted former members of the Supreme Court who were no longer alive, Sandra Day O'Connor, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, along with Elena Kagan, Sonia Sotomayor, and added Amy Coney Barrett. Well, as you well know, the woke mob came after them, and then also Kappa Delta, because Amy Coney Barrett is a KD, they came after them as well. And so we wanted to give you an opportunity to express your desire to not always give in to the woke mob. And so on Friday, we did post a piece in our Take Action item, Girl Scouts and Kappa Delta succumb to woke mob. At the time, we just gave you a chance to maybe put your name on a petition, but now we've confined it and really reconfigured it so that now it can also send an email to both the Girl Scouts and Kappa Delta. So if you wanted to express your opinion to them, you can do that as well. When we come back, we're going to talk with Joseph Backholm, Senior Fellow for Biblical Worldview and Strategic Engagement. It's Family Research Council about why Christians should vote. That's coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Tomorrow's the election, so you may have already voted like tens of millions, but if you haven't, I encourage you to vote because your vote might make the difference. In the past, many groups circulated articles and emails talking about the importance of one vote. In the last few elections, we haven't needed these reminders because some of the elections in the last few decades provided numerous illustrations. For example, George W. Bush won the 2000 presidential election by the slimmest of margins. His election essentially was decided by 537 votes in Florida. He won re-election in the 2004 presidential election again by a very slim margin. He won the 20 electoral votes from the state of Ohio with 50.8% of the vote. Over the years, I've collected some stories of elections that resulted in a tie. You can't get any closer than that. Consider the story of Penny Pullen in Illinois. It turned out that it was a tie, and so they ordered a coin toss, and she lost in the coin toss. Later, she found out that many members of her church hadn't bothered to vote in the primary election, and they could have made a crucial difference. In 2006, there was an even more interesting story of an electoral tie. William Crawford and Jane Miller both received an identical number of votes in an election in Ohio. William Crawford was especially upset. You might ask why. Well, it turned out that his two sons failed to vote that day. His son Jim lives across the street from him. His other son Andy is a college student who lives at home with him. Neither took the time to go to the polls. Would the outcome of these elections be different if a few people in Penny Pullen's church had bothered to vote, or if either of William Crawford's sons had bothered to vote? Does one vote count? Just ask Penny Pullen or William Crawford. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of the booklet, A Biblical View on Pornography, go to viewpoints.info/pornography. That's viewpoints.info/pornography.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, as I've said, quite a number of you, perhaps a majority of you have already voted, but if you have not, certainly wanted to talk about why Christians should vote, and there are some really good articles we've posted. We picked out just a couple. One in terms of what is important in terms of one vote. Would one vote really make a difference? And then another one, which I know many of you find yourself in a state where a majority of people in your state are going to vote differently than you, and you say, what point is it for me to vote in a state when I know that my state's going to go the opposite direction of how I'm going to vote? So we're going to get into those issues, and these are two of four very good pieces that have come out through our friends at the Family Research Council. Joseph Backholm is the Senior Fellow for Biblical Worldview and Strategic Engagement at the Family Research Council. In the past has served as legal counsel of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, also has served as the legislative attorney as well as the president and general counsel for the Family Policy Institute in the state of Washington, and an individual that has a bachelor's degree from the University of Washington and a law degree from Seattle University. So, Joseph, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hey, thank you. It's so good to be with you.
Glad to have you join us. And I did a commentary today on the close elections, but I wanted, before we even talk about mine, to talk about some of the things that you have written. One of those is one vote doesn't make a difference. Take on that myth, because you have some really good examples of how important one vote really is.
Yeah, it really is. And in recent history, and the best recent example we have is in the state of Virginia in 2017, the House of Delegate race there, which is what they call the House of Representatives. There was a race there that actually ended in a tie after more than 20,000 votes, and they drew the winner out of a hat, literally pulled a name. It was a lottery to find out who won. And the significant thing about that is that race determined the majority in the House of Delegates. So the entire balance of power was determined by picking a name out of a hat because there wasn't one more vote that had been cast in order to decide that. And we saw a similar thing in New Mexico recently. A state House race was decided by 2 votes. And so, yes, in very specific races, 1 vote makes a ton of difference, which in some cases determines the entire direction of a state.
You know, when you think about this, as you point out, last time we had 138 million, almost 139 million votes. This time I think it's going to be about 140 million. And so, well, 1 vote there. But even in the presidential race, I point out in my commentary that if you go back to the 2000 presidential election, and I recognize some of our listeners are younger, so they didn't go through that. Essentially, George W. Bush was decided, his election was decided by 537 votes in Florida. So you can see how close these elections are. And as you work down the ballot, as you point out here, many of these other elections, more of which are taking place this time than ever because of COVID, a lot of these races for school board, for mayor, city council, and those kinds of things are also on the ballot. And those oftentimes are decided by just a few votes, aren't they?
That's exactly right. The more local a race is, the more influence we as individuals have over that. You know, increasingly people are really concerned about school board races and what it's being taught in their local school. And those races are sometimes unopposed. Only one person is running because only one person cared to file. And in some cases, those races are won by dozens of votes, not thousands of votes. And so, you know, it's one reason to know that we can get involved and actually take over and have a lot of influence just on the school board if we decide we want it, but also recognizing that, you know, one vote makes less of an impact in a presidential race, but the closer you get to home in races that really impact our lives, the more impact your vote does have.
People always love to laugh at, and I feel sorry about this, but I did use an example that ended in an electoral tie in Ohio, and that was between William Crawford and Gene Miller. And I always love to use this example because William Crawford was very upset because it ended up in a tie, another one of those ones where they flipped a coin or pulled it out of a hat, I can't remember which, because it turned out his 2 sons, Jim, who lived across the street from him, and his son Andy, who's a college student who lived with him, neither of them took time to go to the polls. So just if you could have gotten one of your kids to vote for you, it wouldn't have been a tie. But let me just point out that one of the things we're making available to you today is we have posted 2 of these very good articles by Joseph, but there are actually 4. So let me go through each one. The first one we're talking about, 1 vote doesn't make a difference. Another one, number 2, is God's in charge anyway, so it doesn't matter if I vote. Number 3, I don't like either candidate, so what's the point? I've heard that before. And then one we'll get to in just a minute. I'm not in the majority where I live, so why bother? Because we have a number of listeners that say, look, I'm not going to vote in the way that people in the state of California are going to vote, the state of New York or Rhode Island or a number of other places where we broadcast, because we broadcast in more than 3 dozen states. But each one of these is important because it brings us back, Joseph, to our citizenship responsibility, right? We shouldn't try to figure out if our vote's going to make a difference. We should vote our conscience, shouldn't we?
Well, we should, and and take it from a guy from Seattle, right? I'm a conservative Christian from Seattle, and we are, a minority of people in many ways. And so I understand the frustration, but there is a responsibility part of that God gives us authority, and we have an obligation to be stewards of everything God gives us. And one of those things is authority, and it's a stewardship responsibility that He gives to us. He doesn't demand that we control the outcome. He does demand that we be faithful with what He's given us and let Him handle the results. But beyond that, it's also important for people to know that a majority never wins the election. No election has ever been determined by the majority of a state or a majority of a country. It's always determined by the majority of the people who show up. And in 2016, President Trump was elected with the votes of fewer than 20% of the people who lived in America at that time, and only 25% of the people who were eligible voters. And every election is determined not by the majority of the people who are actually there, it's the majority of the people who participate. So if we acting, out of a responsibility of stewardship and recognizing this is what God gives us, if we fulfill our obligation when other people just can't be bothered to do so, our influence is far greater than what our actual, numbers might suggest in a census.
Well, and again, we've had some people say, I not voted in the past, and I realized if I didn't vote, I can't complain about the outcome. And George Barna is somebody we have on the program pretty regularly, and he's found that about 61% of eligible evangelicals voted in the 2016 election.
Right.
That percentage might go up a little higher for 2020, but that still means that almost 40% did not vote. And that is we can't do anything about it now, but I would encourage listeners that say, well, I didn't even register to vote, or I didn't vote. You're missing an opportunity to actually be a good citizen, right?
That's exactly right. And everybody, everybody does vote in a sense. That your influence, something happens with it. It's either used for something good or it's not used for something good. And not to choose is to choose. It is a choice. And so our indifference and our apathy has an influence on what happens in the future. It just doesn't have a positive influence. We cede our influence to people who have a different worldview and a different value system and different goals. And so, again, we don't control the result, but we do control what we do with what we have. And somebody is going to make a decision, and it might as well be you.
I would think so. One of the reasons we wanted to have a couple of links is so people can find them. Of course, they can go to frc.org, and they can find all of those there, or the frcblog.com. Either way, we have all the links there. But if nothing else, Joseph, just talk about this, because we have some individuals listening right now that say, well, I voted, but I've been trying to convince my son, daughter, a niece, nephew, neighbor to vote. Yeah. These are resources they could pass on to them, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I hope they do. And you're right. One of the primary reasons I think people don't vote is because they honestly just don't feel prepared and they don't feel informed. And one thing I want to point people to is actually this year, for the first time in U.S. history that I'm aware of, you can receive your voter guide via text message anywhere in America. If you text your zip code to 53445, you can get a voter guide from FRC that ranks people from very conservative to very liberal. You can find out who's giving them money to their campaign, who they've been endorsed by, everything that anybody would need to make an assessment of who they agree with and who they don't agree with, simply by texting your zip code to 53445. And I think that educational component is what will push a lot of people over the edge, where they feel like, okay, now I actually have the information I need. And the information you'll get there, it would take you, and has taken people months to assemble in research, and you can get on your phone in about 3.5 seconds if you text your zip code to 53445.
And again, you can find all of that at frc.org. And Joseph, I appreciate you joining us today, and I would encourage people to sign up for the mailing list there on frc.org to support that organization, because that's what I do, and I'm not asking you to do anything that I don't do. So thank you for joining us. I look forward to the next opportunity.
Means a lot. Thank you.
We're going to take a break. What about the possibility that some of these rioters were going to come against the Family Research Council or Gary Bauer? We'll talk about that right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. About a half an hour, we're going to have Colonel Alan West with us, and he'll be talking about a number of issues. One of his really pointed commentaries on America's useful idiots. Also, a video that you can watch on the attempt to fundamentally transform America and what's at stake in this election. And he has a number of other things he wants to talk about, so we will spend some time with him. And if you'd like to ask him a question, make a comment, he will be with us in about a half an hour. But let me, before we get to that, talk about how this election could be so controversial if it is close, because there's more and more evidence of the possibility that if indeed the outcome is not one that is appreciated by various people that are out in the streets, we could have turmoil in the streets. And a lot of individuals in law enforcement are preparing for that. And then even if there isn't conflict in the streets, and I think there will be, there's going to be a incredible amount of conflict in the courts. Are you aware of the fact the best estimates I have are at least 325 different lawsuits have been filed since the primaries in about 45 different states, including also Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico. So we're going to talk about that. This one came out this morning, Politico. Biden camp quietly raises money for post-election court brawl. So we're in for it for quite a while, if indeed the election is close, or it's close in certain swing states. And I'm looking at you, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, and some others, maybe even Florida. So we'll see where that goes. But let's, if I can, read the headlines. First of all, Jim Garrity put these together. Thank you for doing that, as he always is so good at summarizing this. Let's look at 4 different cities right now and see what's happening. New York City. Headline, many businesses in New York City are boarding up their stores in preparation for potential mayhem as Election Day approaches. I'm going to come back and talk a little bit about what some of the people in these areas of law enforcement in New York and Los Angeles are doing. But let me get to the next headline from Los Angeles, or actually the cut line. From Beverly Hills to Hollywood to downtown Los Angeles, crews have been busy adding plywood and protective fencing in front of businesses and residential complexes. So that's New York, Los Angeles. How about a couple more? Chicago. In preparation of potential unrest in Chicago leading up to and following Tuesday's general election, Macy's State Street has boarded up windows in the iconic location. And then the one I really have been paying attention to, what's happening right now in Washington, D.C. Despite the wet weather Sunday morning, workers near Black Lives Matter Plaza, remember that was the one created by the mayor, were busy erecting more plywood barriers over some buildings' windows. If you didn't know any better, you would be forgiven if you thought they were prepping for a big storm about to blow into the nation's capital. And so we recognize that sometimes there are celebrations that get out of hand, and we've seen this in Los Angeles. You might remember when the Los Angeles Lakers won the NBA title back a month ago in October. The city's downtown saw 76 arrests after celebrations turned unruly. Then more recently, just about a week or so ago, the Los Angeles Dodgers, if you're not aware, won the World Series. And if nothing else, I think you had 8 people were arrested. Multiple officers were injured. A semi-truck was looted, and police vehicle and some businesses were vandalized. So sometimes those celebrations have to do with, I'm excited about who won, but most people think that actually these protests are going to happen if Donald Trump wins and Joe Biden loses. Let's look at what's happening a little more detail in some of these cities. We'll go to New York City. This one by Jake Dima in Daily Caller. New York City Police Department told businesses within the boroughs to prepare for possible political violence. That actually comes from a story that was reported in the Wall Street Journal. The department had reportedly been preparing for weeks to keep the city secure in the event of an election-induced calamity. Fox News, of course, give us the same kind of numbers here. Miami, Portland, Seattle, Minneapolis, Orlando, Chicago, many cities are preparing for this as well. Let's stay back in New York for just a minute, because the New York-based Sergeants Benevolent Association, the vice president said that he has not seen such disaster preparation since kind of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. He said, quote, stuff like this was done during 9/11 when everybody went to 12-hour shifts, but they basically put the whole job on alert right now. He said, I'd be lying to you if I wouldn't say I was worried. We've already seen cops get assaulted in New York the last time this broke out. This is something not to take lightly. And then if you go to Los Angeles, one of the veterans of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department said what they're probably doing right now is canceling days off and going on their form of tactical alert. They're probably preparing response teams. They're going to get those rosters all squared away and make sure they've got the equipment that they're going to need. So really kind of preparing for the worst case scenario. As we mentioned when we started this hour, we should certainly be praying about what is taking place around the country. And I would certainly encourage you to pray for those in law enforcement and pray for peace and civility out on the streets. But everybody is preparing for the worst. It's gotten even more concerning because one of the things we learned from Gary Bauer, by the way, he'll be with us, I think he's on with us the day after the election. Gary Bauer, of course, is with the American Values and also is the head of what's called the Campaign for Working Families. And he said he got a very unsettling phone call. He said the people informing him said that a coalition of the worst, as he said, far-left neo-Marxist groups in Washington called Shut Down D.C. is promising attacks on conservative organizations and their leaders in the Washington, D.C. area. He said, just so there's no confusion, they literally have provided these kind of almost stormtroopers with a convenient map with the addresses of these groups and the people they want taken down. And he said, I want you to know that Campaign for Working Families is one of those organizations that has been targeted. And these are individuals that just even last week were attacking the police. You probably did not hear about it because the mainstream press ignored it. Local media pretty much ignored it. Bottom line is you had 15 police officers that were seriously injured. One might be permanently blinded. And so he says, you know, these are trained left-wing revolutionaries. He said, we've seen them in the streets of Kenosha, Minneapolis, Portland. They may even be coming to your town as well. Given where we broadcast, no doubt some of you may actually see some of them. And so anyway, what Gary Bauer has been doing right now is doing what he can to actually review the security measures to protect his office and the staff. And they're also now, this particular group, Shut Down D.C., is putting out the home addresses of some of these conservative leaders. So, you know, we're talking Family Research Council, Concerned Women for America. I mean, you know the list. And this is of great concern. So, if nothing else, if you want another prayer target, there it is for nothing else. So there are just a number of issues that are starting to surface right now, not the least of which is what's going to happen in a couple of these key swing states. You have seen that both Joe Biden and Donald Trump have spent a fair amount of time both in Florida and Pennsylvania. Florida really is key. The last time I looked at somebody who was doing these odds, and I don't trust these too much, but nevertheless, if Joe Biden wins Florida, I think there's like an 83% chance that he becomes the next president. If he loses Florida and Donald Trump wins, it gets down to 50%. So Florida is a key state. Pennsylvania is a key state. Of course, every state is a key state, but nevertheless, those are the big issues that we're going to be paying attention to. And tomorrow, I will spend a little more time talking about what to look for, because what we're starting to see are people talking about the fact that you might have a blue mirage and then a red mirage. In other words, if you have many more Republicans that actually voted by mail, Texas is one example people talked about. We'll talk about a little bit more with Colonel Alan West, since he heads up the Texas Republican Party. You might initially from Texas get what might be a blue mirage, and it looks like, hey, maybe Texas is going to go blue, but then as the out of the mail-in ballots come in, it will go the other way. Pennsylvania, almost the reverse. You might get what looks like a red mirage, but then as they count those other ballots, which can be counted up to days later, which we'll talk about in just a minute, it might turn out very differently. All of that to say that I'm going to try to give you a little bit of information tomorrow as you watch it on television, you listen to it, because in some respects, what you first hear may not necessarily pan out in light of some things we know about the election. Most importantly, don't pay attention to any poll except the one that takes place tomorrow night. We'll be right back after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and then we're going to spend some time talking with Lieutenant Colonel Alan West. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. More than 325 lawsuits have been filed. A very significant number of those by Democrats, but some by Republicans in an attempt to try to prevent some of the changing of the rules. But nevertheless, this may set a record for sure, because these have been filed in 45 different states, in addition to, of course, the District of Columbia, and even in Puerto Rico. One individual who is a professor of law at the University of California, Irvine School of Law, says the amount of litigation is almost certainly going to be a record, and I think that is indeed the case. What we see is right now there are war rooms being developed. I just mentioned a minute ago the Biden camp quietly raises money for post-election court brawl, and a lot of that comes from the various war rooms that have been put forward, but one of those headed up by Mark Elias. That name might be familiar to some of you. He was general counsel to the former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, also worked on her campaign, and is really now working on the Biden campaign to put together a legal war room full of lawyers fighting these cases. And so a lot of this is going to be an attempt to fight any particular attempt to throw out some of the ballots if they don't have signatures or if there's some evidence of fraud. On the opposite side, of course, you have Republicans gearing up as well. And, of course, you had President Donald Trump in a tweet came out a while back, said, the greatest election fraud in our history is about to happen. And he is very concerned and has been talking about this idea of voter fraud for some time. Now, you might be familiar with some of this because we've talked about it on the program. One of my most recent booklets goes into it in some detail. But what is, I think, so striking is that even though there's an attempt on the part of some, the Brennan Center for Justice, and even a lot of people in the mainstream media saying that voter fraud is rare, they have to turn a blind eye to all the things that have happened just in the primary season. The primaries for the Democratic side have been contested, and we have all sorts of primary issues and fraud. Matter of fact, almost 500,000 ballots were thrown out for one reason or another. We had such a contested primary in one case in the third largest city in New Jersey, Paterson, that they had to have a mulligan. I think there are now 4 individuals out of that case that have been actually indicted for fraud. And so they have to now actually have the election tomorrow to decide an election that should have already been decided during the primary, the 12th Congressional District in New York. I've given you lots of examples. But again, if you'd like to read about some of this, go to the Heritage Foundation. They have what's called the Election Fraud Database. Now, the database is not comprehensive. They simply have a listing of the various proven incidents of voter fraud. In other words, this is where people have actually been convicted, and they have, 1,300 proven incidents of voter fraud. More than a dozen of those have happened in these primaries we've just been talking about on the Democrat side. And these cases in 2020 range from forged signatures, falsified registration forms, people voting more than once, even bribing homeless people to vote a certain way. So when you have people say, well, these are very rare, yes, but they exist. And as Hans von Spakovsky, who used to be on the Federal Elections Commission, who put together this database fraud database, has pointed out, yes, okay, these aren't necessarily always widespread, but they can be very impactful in certain races, especially when they're very close. So that's the first issue. But even if you set aside the issue of voter fraud, we have the whole question about late ballots. And these late arriving ballots are the subject of all sorts of lawsuits, because you've seen that in one case, the Supreme Court, I think, accurately ruled last Monday that they wanted to prohibit the state of Wisconsin from counting ballots that came after the election. The legislature in Wisconsin says you have to have your ballot in by Election Day. And instead, a federal judge says, no, we can let them come in a few days later. And I think the Supreme Court wisely, in this case, ruled against that change and saying, this is the rule established by the legislature. This is the rule we should have. Unfortunately, in the previous votes by Chief Justice John Roberts, he voted with the liberals and so did not establish the same kind of principle in Pennsylvania in particular, but also in North Carolina. But Pennsylvania being one of the biggest ones, in which now in Pennsylvania, the court said you don't have to reject late ballots as long as a ballot comes in 3 days after the election. They can still be counted. And, of course, then that gets into the whole question of mismatched signatures, because some of those individuals have not signed them or the signatures don't match. And so if indeed the election is close in Pennsylvania and both Joe Biden and Donald Trump need Pennsylvania to win, oh boy, this thing could go into overtime, so we'll see where we are. Tomorrow we're going to give you a little better prediction on what might take place, but I think it is probably still fair to assume that Donald Trump's going to win Texas and Georgia and Iowa and Florida and Ohio, that Biden's going to win, of course, all of the West Coast and most of the Northeast, probably still win Nevada, Arizona, North Carolina, maybe. And so if that's the case, then you could indeed have a President Joe Biden. But you have to pay attention also to something else that would happen to Kamala Harris if that happened. Because if you look at the Senate races, the the Republicans have 53. They'll pick up Alabama, that's 54. But then I think they might possibly lose in Maine, Colorado, North Carolina, Arizona. If that happened, and that's a big if, because, Tom Tillis or maybe Cory Gardner or somebody else could win. But if indeed that is the case, you could end up with a 50-50 tie in the Senate. That's assuming that both the Georgia seats go to the Republicans, which I think they might. And that would mean then the Vice President Kamala Harris would spend the next 2 years having to break up ties. Or if you believe that Donald Trump is going to win and this still plays out in the Senate, that means that Mike Pence would have to spend most of his time in the U.S. Senate breaking 50-50 ties. So there are just all sorts of scenarios that will play themselves out. But I think the most likely one is we may not know on election night who actually won. And if nothing else, if that encourages you, first of all, to vote if you have not voted, and number two, to pray for the future of this country, this could be a very long week or month of trying to resolve some of this in the courts. So we'll see where it unfolds. But let me again mention that we have information for you. If you would like to get it from the iVoter Guide, my Viewpoints commentary today is about close elections. And for those of you that wanted to take action, as we suggested you might want to do on Friday with the Girl Scouts in Kappa Delta, we have now not only an opportunity, as we did before, for you to sign a petition. Now there's a way in which if you put your name, address, or name and email, I guess is all we really need, we can make it possible for you to send a note to both the Girl Scouts and the Kappa Delta sorority if you'd like to do so. So anyway, those resources are available to you at our website, pointofview.net. If you find yourself saying, I'd like to find some of those articles by Joseph Backholm, those are available at the website. If you'd like to read some of the material written by and then the video by Alan West, that's on the website as well, because we want to give you as much information and resources as possible. And of course, most importantly, we encourage you to pray for this nation and pray for this election. Let's take a break. Colonel Alan West will be with us right after these important messages.
(2020). It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Now we have an opportunity to talk with our good friend, Colonel Alan West, an individual that, of course, had a 22-year career in the United States Army, also was elected to Congress in Florida's 22nd District, an individual with, of course, a bachelor's degree from the University of Tennessee, 2 master's degrees from Kansas State University and the U.S. Army Command and General Staff Officers College, but most importantly, an individual probably has more jobs than anybody can possibly count, because in addition to not only heading up the Texas Republican Party right now, is also an individual that heads up what is called the Hope Center, and most importantly, an individual that we count on to give us some great perspective on that. Not only a Fox News contributor, but also a columnist for the townhall.com and author, of course, of Guardian of the Republic, as well as Hold Texas, Hold the Nation. So it is great to have you once again on this program, Colonel Alan West.
Good to be with you, Kerby. It's been too long.
And I thought we might start by just talking about what is happening in the state of Texas, because after all, since we last talked to you, you are now the head of the Texas Republican Party, and you've been watching how many people have voted, and these numbers are just off the charts in terms of early voting. But what have you found even in the state of Texas?
Well, yeah, you're absolutely right. Texas has about 16.2 million people registered to vote. And through the early voting, we have 9.7 million Texans that have already voted, being in-person early voting and also the mail-in absentee ballots, and that is leading the country. And we have already surpassed our turnout numbers for voting from 2016, 4 years ago, presidential election. So it's very encouraging to see Texans out and being a part of this electoral process. And this past weekend, I was down in the Rio Grande Valley from Harlingen up to McAllen, over to Rio Grande City, Laredo, Eagle Pass, and Del Rio. And what you see, and what you see happening in the Rio Grande Valley is just indicative of how people are paying attention. And previously, 4 years ago, I doubt that you would have found one Trump sign down in the Rio Grande Valley. Now you have tens of thousands of people out doing Trump parades, being on the street corners, riding around the town. So there's an enthusiasm and there's an energy here in the great state of Texas.
What about your state that you used to represent in Florida? It does seem to me right now that both the Trump campaign and the Biden campaign see Florida as really key. And I was struck by the fact that we also saw that not only were there rallies that both of those campaigns holding in places like Tampa, but then Donald Trump going to Miami-Dade, that's considered a Democratic stronghold. Do they know some things about how Florida might go that most of us don't know?
Well, they've seen the indicators and the warnings. And, of course, Texas and Florida are key. Texas has 38 electoral votes. Florida has 29. And, you know, I used to live down in Broward County for 10 years, and that's where I represented Broward and Palm Beach County. And the fact that you have President Trump highly competitive in Miami-Dade County and also in Palm Beach County, 2 of the 3 most blue counties in the state of Florida, that is really going to upset the apple cart for Joe Biden and the Democrat Party, the Progressive Socialist Left. You had 30,000 cars turn out in South Florida for a Trump parade. But think about this. You have a huge expatriate community from Cuba and also from Venezuela. So they know this rhetoric. They've heard it before. They fled those countries. They know what socialism, Marxism, communism leads to, and they don't want to see it happen here in their new adopted country, the United States of America.
Well, as I'm hopping around here, let's go to Georgia because that's where you're originally from. I think because of the nature of the Senate elections in Georgia, it's quite likely that one, maybe two, but certainly one of those Georgia elections will not be decided tomorrow night, but instead maybe in a runoff January 5th. And so we might not necessarily know who actually would control the United States Senate till come January. Is that a possibility?
Well, I think that you're going to see a lot of electoral success here in Texas, Iowa, and also out in Arizona. I believe that Cory Gardner will end up pulling it out in Colorado, and Mitch McConnell get reelected in Kentucky. So I don't think that Georgia will be that linchpin that some people might think it may end up being. I think that you're going to have a very decisive victory across the board tomorrow night. But I will tell you one thing is that the Democrat Party is heavily dependent upon the Atlanta metropolitan area to dictate the politics of the incredible state of Georgia. Georgia is second only to Texas with the amount of counties that they have. I think it's about 158, maybe 160 counties in Georgia. But when you get outside of Atlanta, you get into a very strong conservative country, and I don't believe that the Democrats will prevail in the state of Georgia. And again, so many people understand, Georgia, like Texas, a very strong agricultural state, very strong with its port facilities there out of Savannah, and very strong with its national security and military footprint. They don't want to go back to the failed years of the Obama administration. That's what you get with Joe Biden.
Yes. Well, again, as we look nationwide, it seems to me that you have some trends playing out in terms of the various states. But I thought, I don't like to look at identity politics too often, but this is one that has surfaced in our conversations on Friday, the African-American vote, because last time you have Donald Trump winning the presidency with about 8% of the African-American vote. Dr. Merrill Matthews was on with us on Friday, had a piece in The Hill saying that Hispanic vote and African-American vote might actually elect Donald Trump. And you're starting to see a lot of these rappers, and I hardly ever talk about rappers on Point of View, but a number that have, as well as a number of others suggesting that whether you look at it anecdotally or even some of the statistics that have come out from the Rasmussen poll and others, that there may be a much higher percentage of minority vote for Donald Trump. What do you see?
No, you're absolutely right. President Trump got 8% of the black vote in 2016. I believe that he'll get somewhere between 20 to 25%. I've seen some polling estimates taking it up to 31%. But without a doubt, you look at the policies that he has enacted, the lowest unemployment ever in the black community, the support to historical black colleges and universities, the criminal justice reform, the education and economic opportunity zones. He's delivered, unlike the empty promises. And, President Trump made a great point in that last debate. He's done more in 47 months than Joe Biden did in 47 years, and he has definitely done more for the black community than the quote-unquote first black president, Joe Biden, did in 8 years. And that has been resonating. And then also in 2016, President Trump got about 27, 28% in the Hispanic community, that vote. I think he's going to go way over 40%, maybe up to 45% support in the Hispanic community, because that's exactly what I saw down in the Rio Grande Valley this past weekend.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation for a few more minutes with Colonel Allen West. And if you would like to know more about him, we certainly have a link to his website. We've also posted a couple of his articles, America's Useful Idiots, one that he's written, also a video on fundamentally transforming America. So we want to talk about some of that. And you may have heard a little bit of a flap that he's responded to about this bus that was the Biden bus, where there were a number of Trump supporters crowding the bus. So we'll talk about that. But if you'd like to ask a question, make a comment before he goes, that number is open, 1-800-351-1212. We come back, we have a lot more to cover, especially the concern about violence in the streets, and what about an election that goes into overtime? All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Tomorrow is the election, so you may have already voted like tens of millions, but if you haven't, I encourage you to vote because your vote might make the difference. In the past, many groups circulated articles and emails talking about the importance of one vote. In the last few elections, we haven't needed these reminders because some of the elections in the last few decades provided numerous illustrations. For example, George W. Bush won the 2000 presidential election by the slimmest of margins. His election essentially was decided by 537 votes in Florida. He won re-election in the 2004 presidential election again by a very slim margin. He won the 20 electoral votes from the state of Ohio with 50.8% of the vote. Over the years, I've collected some stories of elections that resulted in a tie. You can't get any closer than that. Consider the story of Penny Pullen in Illinois. It turned out that it was a tie, and so they ordered a coin toss, and she lost in the coin toss. Later, she found out that many members of her church hadn't bothered to vote in the primary election, and they could have made a crucial difference. In 2006, there was an even more interesting story of an electoral tie. William Crawford and Gene Miller both received an identical number of votes in an election in Ohio. William Crawford was especially upset. You might ask why. Well, it turned out that his two sons failed to vote that day. His son Jim lives across the street from him. His other son Andy is a college student who lives at home with him. Neither took the time to go to the polls. Would the outcome of these elections be different if a few people in Penny Pullen's church had bothered to vote, or if either of William Crawford's sons had bothered to vote? Does one vote count? Just ask Penny Pullen or William Crawford. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of the booklet, A Biblical View on Pornography, go to viewpoints.info/pornography. That's viewpoints.info/pornography.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continuing our conversation today with Colonel Alan West. If you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Colonel Alan West, if nothing else, 325 or more lawsuits been filed in primaries in 45 different states, including Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico. And just before you came on, I talked about Mark Elias, who used to be the counsel for Hillary Clinton's campaign, now heading up a legal war room. I think, if nothing else, we've encouraged people to pray about this election and pray for a landslide, just for the fact that if this thing goes into overtime, you and I are old enough to remember what it looked like in 2000 there in Florida counting hanging chads.
No, we're absolutely right. I do remember that. But I think that it's going to be a pretty decisive victory, and I think that we will know. I think the president will be able to get to 270 electoral votes, and you won't see everyone saying we have to wait 2, 3, 4 days after the election. And definitely, I don't think we have to worry about Nancy Pelosi being sworn as the president because we won't have a decision in January of next year because the choice is just so incredibly divergent. And as a matter of fact, one of the biggest searches on Google this past weekend was, how do I change my vote?
Yes.
And I don't think those were Republicans looking at how they changed their vote.
Yep. And I think, again, we also recognize, if you're right, and that is Donald Trump wins re-election, we're hearing from, New York, many businesses in New York City are boarding up their stores in preparation for possible mayhem as Election Day approaches. Los Angeles, here this one says, from Beverly Hills to Hollywood to downtown Los Angeles, crews are busy adding plywood and protective fencing in front of businesses and residential complexes. And even before you came on, I read from one individual who is with the New York-based Sergeants Benevolent Association, in which he said, I've never seen this kind of disaster preparation in our city of New York since the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And I'm certainly hoping and praying that we'll have peace on the streets, because if not, it could be very contentious over the next couple of days, couldn't it?
It could be, and that's a sad thing. That's one of the great things about the United States of America. We have a peaceful transition of power, but obviously that's not what the progressive socialist left and these Marxists want. They want domination, they want control, they want power, and by any means necessary, of course, is their marching orders, their mantra. And so when you look at what has happened, like you said, New York, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., and even here in the great state of Texas, Kirby, the governor has decided to mobilize and activate the National Guard to go to our 5 largest metropolitan centers. And that's because when you go onto these leftist websites, they are talking about violence. They're talking about a revolution. Here in Austin, Texas, they're saying, don't vote, be a part of the revolution.
Well, let's, if we can, talk about a Texas story, but I think it's gotten some national play, and that is you had, which surprised me, the Biden-Harris bus come to Texas, because Kamala Harris spent an entire day in Texas. Do they really think they were going to win Texas? But nevertheless, that bus got pushed around a little bit by some of these Trump supporters with Trump flags and pickup trucks. And I know you've been speaking to that, and I know a couple of people in the press wanted to get your thoughts about that.
Well, they did want to get my thoughts about it, and I asked a very simple question. Where were they when you've had 3 Trump supporters been executed this year? One in Portland, one in Denver, and one black man in Milwaukee. Where have they been with the McCloskey issue, where a mob threatened to rape the wife, kill the man, and burn their house down? They came back a second day after that very first day. Where have they been with all of these issues of Trump supporters being attacked all throughout these 4 years? And they haven't said anything. I remember the kid that got punched in the face out at University of California, Berkeley. So when you really go back and analyze the video, you see that there was a white SUV, crossover SUV, that belonged to the Biden campaign that crashed into one of the Trump trucks, one of the Trump vehicles. And I think the San Marcos police is looking into this and looking into charging the Biden campaign for that. And so that's really what happened. And the reason why the Biden-Harris bus has left Texas, there were more Trump supporters showing up at their rallies and at their events than there were Biden-Harris supporters. And so they have left Texas because Texas does not want to transition away from oil and gas. Texas do not want to give up their Second Amendment rights because Kamala Harris wants to do it by executive order. We like our economy to be good and strong. We don't want to see a reversal of the Trump tax cuts, which has really helped our businesses. And look, we just had an incredible GDP report coming out of October. The previous quarter, that means that we are turning things around, even in the face of this COVID-19 issue.
Let's, if we can, talk about that for just a minute, because that's become kind of the issue of what is happening in the nursing homes and the whole issue of the pandemic and those kinds of things. That has been kind of the issue that Joe Biden, former vice president, has really tried to use to fight against some of the actions both by the president, Donald Trump, and by the vice president, Mike Pence, who's been heading up, of course, the coronavirus task force. How should we think about this? Because going forward, that is still an issue on the table, and maybe one of the reasons why we have a record number, almost 97 million people that have already voted.
Well, you know, there's a lot of people out there that believe that all of a sudden we will find a cure for COVID-19 on November the 4th. And so that awaits to be seen. But the most important thing, Kirby, you look at what's going on in Paris, France. Young people are rioting because they don't want to go back into a lockdown. We hear Boris Johnson in England talking about that, Germany looking at doing that as well. The United States of America understands this is a virus that has a 99.96% recovery rate. We understand the targeted, most endangered demographics, those 65 and above, those who have very specific comorbidities, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, obesity, and heart disease. So let's focus on the solutions and not keep going on with this collective punishment. And when Joe Biden says that he wants to go back to a lockdown of America and make everyone across the nation wear masks, That's not a winning formula, and that's not what leaders do.
And that would, as your video points out, would fundamentally transform America, because we the other day just talked about the fact that it really has become economically a V-shaped recovery. I can even talk about individuals we've had on this program like Stephen Moore and others that said, well, it's probably going to be more like a U-shape. Some people say it's going to be more like a Nike swoosh. We really have had a dramatic recovery to the economy in a short period of time. And so in some respects, I'll let me let this be kind of your last comment, kind of the ending statement. It does seem to me that we have two very competing visions for America, which for those people that are listening to this and haven't voted, they should consider before they go in and vote tomorrow.
You're absolutely right. And I remember that commercial that Ronald Reagan did where he talked about his morning in America. And just think about, Joe Biden standing up and saying it's going to be a dark winter. I served in combat, 3 different combat zones. No one's going to follow a frantic Fanny into a combat zone, into a battle. No one's going to follow someone that is going to be raging and talking about how we're going to be defeated or, we're going to lose lives. People are looking for someone that has an optimistic viewpoint, regardless of the situation that you are in. And so I think that's what they see with President Donald Trump, and that's why I think he will be successful. And look, all the numbers and the statistics, like the economic quarterly GDP that came out, it just points to that.
Let me again just encourage those of you that would like to get some more information about Colonel Allen West. We have all sorts of links to his website that you will find very helpful, because those are ones that you might want to use in the future in terms of the oldschoolpatriot.com. And I've posted a couple of different articles, videos, and other resources. And most importantly, of course, as the head of the Texas Republican Party, you can contact him as well, get some of his inside information. And Colonel West, it is always a delight to have you on the program.
It's my pleasure, and look forward to talking to you after the election.
We are going to be doing that as well. Let me give those of you the chance, if you would like to make a comment. We're going to have kind of an open line in this last half hour. Got a couple of pieces that we have not been able to get to yet. Byron York actually makes a very compelling case. He says, yes, there is a hidden Trump vote. How significant that is will be seen early enough. And you hear Colonel West saying, look, there are all sorts of people that are predicting that Joe Biden's going to win this in a walk, and he's actually convinced it's going to go the other direction. And so that gets into the issue of what's called the shy Trump voter. I don't like the term, but that's what it's called. I did a commentary on it last week. But Byron York goes into it in a lot more detail because he's giving us his experience as he was traveling around in Pennsylvania. So I thought I'd read that real quickly. If we have time, might also get into a very good piece that came out by our good friend Robert Knight, wallowing in moral equivalence, and how some people just have trouble making a decision when the decision is so clear if you look at it from a moral perspective. So we'll get into some of those issues. And we did talk about this issue of the pandemic, some very significant evidence coming out now that, if anything, we really need to protect the areas around nursing homes, because that's where most of the loss of life is taking place right now. So we'll get into that pandemic and some other issues right after these important messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. You know, we've been waiting so long for the election. It is tomorrow, of course. And the value of it is multifold. First of all the polls have said that Joe Biden is going to win in a walk. And that is certainly what you are seeing from most of the polls, but there are some that are saying no, they have not done a good job of really evaluating individuals who are going to vote for Donald Trump but aren't going to tell the pollsters they are. And so some people have said that if indeed the polls are as wrong this time in 2020 as they were in 2016, you just may not necessarily have anybody trust polling again. And, of course, I've told you not to anyway. But it all gets down to this very significant issue. How many people are going to vote for Donald Trump but aren't telling the pollsters they are? My commentary last week was October 28th, if you'd like to read it. To be fair, I quote from 538, which is an outstanding polling organization that said they found very little sign of shy Trump voters. Also, the American Association for Public Opinion Research said they didn't find any evidence for such voters. But you've had some others that have said you're just not necessarily looking very hard. David Catron, I quoted, talks about the fact that this is a classic appeal to ignorance. In other words, the absence of proof is the proof of its absence. Oh, I see. In other words, by definition, they're hidden. And I gave you some polls that showed that at least 20% of registered voters said they were really uncomfortable revealing their preferred candidate. I gave you one from the Cato Institute, which says there has been a reluctance of conservatives, especially to acknowledge who they may vote for. And so I used that commentary that I had come out last week to illustrate a very good piece that appeared in the Washington Examiner. I was going to even post it, and then I thought, well, I'll just maybe read it. And then I've heard some other talk show hosts quoting from it as well. So I thought, well, I had the right inclination because it comes from Byron York, who is a political correspondent for the Washington Examiner, and he was in Pennsylvania. And that's going to be a very key state. I mean, it's the keystone state, but it may be also the key to who is the next president of the United States. And he says, I had a man who came to President Trump's giant rally at the airport, said he knew someone who planned to vote for Trump, but felt too intimidated to say so publicly. And I asked, he says, who it was, and he said it was his mother. And he said she'd kill me if I told her that I told anyone. I mean, that's just amazing to me that even telling somebody like Byron York would be too much. And so then anyway, this man he was talking to said that lots of people are too afraid to put up a sign for Trump. He was also explaining that if nothing else, he, more than an hour away in his neighborhood, was mixed between Trump and Biden supporters, black and white voters, and all the rest. And he said, I pulled the Trump magnet off my Jeep. Everyone took their signs off, especially after the death of George Floyd. People just don't want to be a target. And so the biggest question, of course, is how many of those hidden Trump voters are out there? Because some of the research are pointed to the most difficult question of the campaign, how to measure the true number of people who will vote for the president but won't tell anybody that they will. And, of course, that gets into the fact that there are certain polling groups like Trafalgar that don't ask a lot of questions, and they do a better job of allowing people to be anonymous. In other words, you don't have to tell me on the phone. You can just send a text, and this will be anonymous, so I'll know where you are, that you voted and told me how you voted, but I wouldn't know how you voted. And that's when you start seeing some examples of that. And we saw some of this in 2016. For our listeners, for example, let's take North Carolina. Back in 2016, Hillary Clinton supposedly had a 7-point lead in North Carolina in 2016. Donald Trump, as many of you may know, won the state by 3 percentage points. There were some other swings that weren't quite as dramatic, but that one's pretty dramatic to mention it. And so then again, Byron York goes on to some other issues. He says, even at a rally where Donald Trump is not there, he said he went to the Ivanka Trump event. Now that's in the middle of kind of farmland, chilly afternoon. Then you had an individual there that said, back in 2016, she said, I didn't even know my neighbors were Trump supporters until election night. And she identified herself as a Pennsylvania voter. She said, you don't tell anyone you know that you support Trump. 75% of the people I work with are against Trump, and it's worse now than it was in 2016. A lot of people are afraid, she says, to speak up. There are a lot of people who are fearful of losing their jobs if they support Donald Trump. which is amazing to me. And so this particular quote from another individual said, for sure, these shy Trump voters most definitely do exist. Some are in the upper middle class suburbs where Trump supporters just don't want to deal with the social aspects of neighbors asking, how can you vote for this guy? But others, he says, are also in traditional Democratic strongholds. DeMarco went on to say, I'm an elected official. This is an individual that actually is Sam DeMarco, is the chairman of the Republican Committee of Allegheny County. Just use that as an example in Pennsylvania. He said, I've had at least a dozen Democratic elected officials tell me they're voting for Trump. They say they don't like where their party has gone so far to the left. But as Democratic elected officials, they can't come out and say that. So that will be something else that we will have to see how much of that exists. Because right now we have anecdotes, but anecdotes are not statistics, and maybe we'll have a better understanding for that as well. Many Democrats and some of the polling groups, as I've pointed out before, don't believe the idea of shy Trump voters. I mentioned just a minute ago, the 538 podcast recently said there isn't good evidence that shy Trump voters exist. Which, how do you say that with a straight face? But okay, that's what they said, and they're certainly entitled to their opinion. But in a few days, they won't be entitled to the real facts in that. And then, interestingly enough, there was another survey in a recent Pennsylvania polling. They tried this. They asked voters whether they would likely or definitely vote for Trump or Biden. Later in the survey, they asked voters if they knew anyone who was likely to vote for Trump but too embarrassed to admit it. Then for the ones who answered yes, they asked, what would that be you? If the answer was yes, they checked back to see what the person had said about their intention to vote. If they said they would definitely vote for Trump, they were not counted on the grounds that a voter already said definitely voting for Trump. And were not a shy Trump voter. So the ones that remained, turned out it was about 2.5% to 3% of the voters in Pennsylvania. And they then qualified as shy Trump voters. People who said they knew other people who were shy voters were not counted in the grounds that they were hard to evaluate their claim. So you start looking at that 2.5% to 3% range, you can begin to see how some of that might change. Again, these are very speculative kinds of evaluations, but they're really intriguing because it illustrates, again, the reason why we try to tell you don't trust what you see being put out as polls, because there is so much variability, not the least of which is we have 30 million mail-in ballots that are outstanding. That doesn't mean that they're all going to come in. It means that some may have already been mailed, but they haven't arrived. It means that some maybe even been filled out, and they're going to try to deliver them tomorrow. It's possible. It also means that some of them are not going to vote. You know, when you run in at this late date, people that say they're undecided. The other day, there was a local TV program that was trying to find some undecided voters, and they finally found one and said he was still undecided. I said to everybody around me, he's not going to vote. I mean, if he hasn't decided who he's going to vote for the day before the election, he's not voting. And that's something you need to understand about that as well. But when we come back from the break, let's, if we can, also talk about a couple of other issues, because so many of these people voted and they didn't know anything about the New York Post article that came out a couple of weeks ago. And it wasn't until just the other day that the New York Post Twitter account was finally unlocked by Twitter. Can you believe this? This is the fourth largest newspaper in the country, the oldest newspaper in the country, one that, if nothing else, actually had its Twitter account locked until the end of day on Friday. That should tell you a lot right there. And, of course, how many of these individuals never have heard the name Tony Bobulinski or anything else? It might not have changed their vote. Matter of fact, there's quite good evidence it may not have. But it just shows you that when we allow people to vote so early, even before the second debate has taken place, we maybe don't have the ability, as we talked about just a minute ago with Alan West, to change your vote. Now, it turns out there's at least a half a dozen states where you can change your vote. And if that is the case in your state, you can consider whether you want to do so. But it illustrates, again, the convenience of voting early, but also some of the dangers of it as well. But if you'd like to join our conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Want to get your comments, and we'll take some of those calls right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Just as a program note, James Carafano will be with us tomorrow, and Buddy Pilgrim the day after. We have, Jim Dennison, Gary Bauer. It's going to be quite a week, and hopefully we'll have some resolution to some of these questions we've had for months about who the next president, who will be in the Senate, the House of Representatives, and other things. But let's, if we can, take some phone calls. Let's head out to Arizona first. KNLB. James, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
How are you doing, my brother? Now, I may be a little long-winded on this one, but I posted something on social media, and it said that some of you out there are voting and saying you are Christian. Now, myself, I vote for the platform that goes by the Bible, or as close to it as possibly can. I need everybody in the United States to really search their hearts and to search what God wants, what he likes, and what God hates. For instance, like abortion, God says do not murder. You need to pick the one that says no abortion. These are big factors. This isn't one party against another. This is good against evil. And we have to stand up and be accounted for. And that's my opinion.
Well, I think you did very well. And, of course, I would certainly recommend some of the conversation that we had with Chelsea, who was sitting in this chair on Thursday on the Millennial Roundtable, looking at life, marriage, and a variety of others. As a matter of fact, even the piece today by Robert Knight talks about the fact that, okay, we are a divided country, but this idea that right now the ruling elite has such hate and contempt for not only Donald Trump and the president, but for the country. They're in for, all in for things that are kind of Marxist ideas. They dismiss rioting, looting, murder, and destruction as a distraction. And he says these are well-educated people, yet they still buy the Marxist lie that people are born good, that they need a more perfect system and bigger government, he says, to achieve nirvana. Anyone who spent much time around small children know this is absurd. I love what he says there. He said, when I cite the Green New Deal, free college, and other wacky proposals that are being proposed in the platform, again, they respond, well, it's no different from the current safety net. It's just a matter of degree. And he goes on to explain how there is probably a tipping point. So he's looking at the same things and just saying, these are educated people who just turn a blind eye to the implications of some of these stands and some of the things in the platform. So, James, I think you did a great job, but I want to get a few others because we talked about the shy Trump voters. Lucy in Texas, KYCC, I think you want to speak to that issue.
Yes. We are shy voters. My adult children and I, we voted for President Trump in 2016, but El Paso is a Democratic-run government for the most part. We don't have too many options for conservatives, and everybody we know. I was working at the time, and even though we weren't supposed to discuss politics, my supervisor, my coworkers, they were all discussing politics, and I never would say anything. I would just say, I don't discuss religion or politics, so I'd walk away. My own family, my siblings, my son-in-law got me a Trump T-shirt. I would never wear it out in public. I honestly, I'm worried about being harassed or having my home or vehicle vandalized, but we are out here. We're just not as outspoken. And, we're out here.
Well, sure.
And I was walking my dog and was talking to a neighbor 3 doors down, and she's a person of faith also. And somehow we got on the topic of the 2016 elections, and come to find out, they voted for President Trump, and they were conservatives, but they don't tell anybody. So we're here. We just, in this city, unless you're part of the Trump train, which we've been having in El Paso, you don't normally put out a sign or discuss politics because immediately people start yelling at you.
Well, and again, there is a real threat that Gary Bauer will be on with us talking about because you have this group called Shut Down DC. Now, think about this for just a minute, Lucy. You don't have to deal with this, and you have to deal with enough. But just imagine if your name is Gary Bauer or Tony Perkins or, we go through the long list of individuals that are part of conservative groups in Washington, D.C. And this group is not only promising attacks against the organization, but the leaders. They're giving out a map and the addresses of the people that they want targeted. And so some of the targets, of course, are going to be their offices. Some of the targets are going to be the home addresses. So there is a price to pay, unfortunately, by the mob. I've been talking about the woke mob that has been critical of the Girl Scouts and Kappa Delta. But this is a mob that is a real mob, a dangerous mob. And so when people say you're just overreacting, I can tell you lots of stories, and I'm sure you probably have had a few examples of that, too, that we just need to pay attention to. So I think you just underscore exactly what, indeed, Byron York found when he went to Pennsylvania. There are all sorts of people who say, I'm voting for Donald Trump. I'm not telling anybody, not even my next-door neighbors, not even necessarily some people in my church who I'm voting for, because there's just too much of a price to pay, and I don't want to pay it right now. So I appreciate you calling in today.
Thank you so much for taking my call. God bless you.
I appreciate you calling in. We're just about out of time, but we will have quite a bit of time for you tomorrow. And a couple things. We will, as we always do on Election Day, talk about all the problems, the lines, the malfunctions, and all of that. And if you want to call in with some things that have happened in your community, I've said before that we have as many correspondents to Point of View as we have listeners. So if you have something you'd like to share, that is the case. And while I'm talking about this idea of these riots, it's hard to believe, but actually Andrew got me thinking about this, because the staff writer for Atlantic, Ann Applebaum, actually said that these riots that everybody's preparing for, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Washington, they're going to be Trump people. And I go, really? Her direct quote is, when conservatives celebrated Trump's election 4 years ago, did they know that in 2020 we would board up shops, prepare for riots, and arrival of militias in order to protest aggressive vote suppression? This is what it has done to America. It's like, really? And I love some of the people saying these downtown stores are being boarded up, not because they think there are Trump supporters that are going to crash there. Trump won in 2016. Trump only got 769,000 votes in all of Los Angeles County, which is nothing. 494,000 votes in New York City, which is nothing. And 12,000 votes in the District of Columbia. Does anybody think that these are the guys going to go out there and knock the windows out? But nevertheless, maybe that more than anything else illustrates what we call sometimes the Trump derangement syndrome, in which a person honestly argues in Atlantic, of all places, that really they're boarding these up because of these Trump people, because they're just so dangerous. Anyway, we're just simply out of time. And if you find yourself saying, you've mentioned quite a bit here, and I want to have access to it. We have some great material by Joseph Backholm on one vote and why bother to vote. We got some great material by Colonel Alan West. And, of course, we have all sorts of information in terms of commentaries and action items. So take the time to visit the website, pointofview.net. Tomorrow we'll, on Election Day, look at what's happening. And then hopefully on Wednesday we'll have some resolution of some of those questions. But Andrew and Steve, thank you for your help behind the scenes. Have a great day. We will see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees, and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yeah, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.